And hello, I'm Sabrina Lamb, the founder and executive director of the World of Money, based in New York City, now in our 16th year and partnered with the YWCA of Metropolitan Chicago. Our mission is to empower children ages 7 to 18 with 120 hours of immersive and relevant online and classroom youth financial and entrepreneurial education. Included in our robust curriculum, our children are taught the flow of money in society and the history of and current day financial institutions. More than a century ago, the economic realities imposed by segregation required African Americans to pool their resources and help each other. Black-owned banks are an important part of this long tradition. During their peak between the end of the Reconstruction era and the start of the Great Depression, more than 130 of these institutions opened for business, providing capital to Black entrepreneurs and prospective homeowners at a time when it was expensive or impossible to get elsewhere. The first Black-owned banks enabled African Americans to accumulate enough capital to start service-oriented businesses like restaurants and nursing homes, insurance companies, catering businesses. And Black-owned banks still today provide the same services as other financial institutions, such as college savings funds, certificates of deposits, loans, and mobile banking. In 2001, there were 48 Black-owned banks, and the numbers have continued to dwindle over the years, partially due to the erosion of their customer base and regulatory restrictions that often favor larger financial institutions. Today, there are only 20 Black-owned banks in the United States. Now, ownership means there's at least 51% ownership of voting stock. So, what are the opportunities? What are the solutions? And where is the help? Over the next 35 minutes, let's have an interactive conversation. Whether you're joining us live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, post your questions in the chat. Now, let's welcome to the World of Money stage the co-founders of the Black Bank Fund, National Black Bank Fund Foundation, Mr. Brandon Comer, Managing Partner, Comer Capital Group, LLC, and Mr. Ashley D. Bell, a Public Policy Partner at the Dentons Law Firm. Brandon, Ashley, welcome to the World of Money.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you for having us. And I really just appreciate you giving us the opportunity. And congratulations on your new partnership. It's just amazing to see how fast you've grown and the reach that you've had with this program and others. And it's just good to be back with you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sabrina. It's a pleasure to be here.
So now I just want to get into this conversation in a tiptoe for half a second. I'm always interested in how you got there. How did you found this amazing initiative? You were minding your own business. Ashley, you were focusing on the Small Business Administration, providing funding and technical support. Brandon with Comer Capital as well. So what happened when you two said, we need to do this and we need to do it now?
Well, that's a great question, Sabrina. And you've been a part of this journey. And, when you and I first connected on this, was on this exact same issue of how do we get our people in our community through COVID and get them access to federal programs that they need to survive. And PPP was at the forefront of that. My time at SBA really helped me understand that crisis where African-American business owners could not get access to the PPP program because they were forced to go through financial institutions, many of which were not Black owned. And as you saw tens of thousands of Black businesses across the country not get access to the capital in the first round of PPP, they fled to Black banks, and they were trying to look for Black banks to come to the rescue when they weren't getting a call back, when they realized that the app on their phone was not an actual relationship with a bank. And we realized that, Black banks were willing. They just weren't able because they were undercapitalized and historically have been put in a position where they couldn't answer the call. Honestly, the greatest financial call of our time when this crisis and this pandemic hit. And so Brandon and I began to answer the question, like, what can we do to ensure that Black banks are not only willing but able to answer the call in times of crisis for our community, but also in times of recalibration, which where we are right now. The entire economy is recalibrating, and we need them strong. Many times they represent communities where people are the first to get fired and the last to get hired. So when the economy takes a dive, Black banks take a dive. Black banks struggle because Black people struggle. But if we can get Black banks strong, they can be the first leg in the stool for our standing up our community once again.
Brandon?
And just to add on to that, we then enter into this post George Floyd era where we had this, a collective shock of consciousness across the country, and we saw many corporations, of goodwill say, how can we be impactful? We recognize that economic justice is racial justice, and what is it that we can do? And we saw corporations, taking on initiatives, like making large deposits with Black banks, excuse me, that, while that could be helpful, it wasn't the most optimal approach, and it didn't have the type of impact that people thought that it would have. And so the second, realization that Ashley and I had was someone needs to look at this holistically. Someone needs to ensure that people know how to be impactful to Black banks, and how to ensure that they're A, capitalized, and B, have the type of opportunities that will drive long-term fee income, balance out their portfolios, et cetera, and do those things that will allow them to be, sustainable now and competitive in the future. And that was the reason we said we needed to build this foundation, partner with, firms like KPMG, and bring in some really smart people to address this holistically, so that we weren't relying upon market reactions and people to do things in silos that wouldn't have that optimal impact.
That sounds wonderful. I'm wondering, what is you knew what the problem was. A lot of people know what the problems were or are, and they, decide that's not going to be my focus for my life, personally or professionally. I feel like there's something in your personal experience that you said, we're going to dedicate our resources to this mission.
Yeah, I think it goes back, it's like Brandon said, post George Floyd, I was marching like millions of Americans peacefully protesting around the country. I was marching with my son downtown Atlanta. And when you're marching downtown Atlanta with streets named after Ralph Abernathy, after Andrew Young, after Martin Luther King, after X.L. Neal, when you're marching down those streets, and it was a march of business leaders, actually, and business leaders, many that didn't look like me. And when you're marching in those marches like that, one of the people that was marching with me was actually the COO of the Atlanta Hawks, the NBA franchise. And, he said it halfway through the march, and he's with his son and I'm with mine. He says, well, what do you do when the march is over? Where do you go? What happens? Like, how does change happen? Because clearly the march is to bring awareness, but somebody has to sit down and figure out what to do next. And I think in that conversation, I decided that, he's right. We got to, every one of us has something to bring to the table. It doesn't matter what you do in this country, no matter what your job. If we all dedicate what we're good at least a little bit of it to this cause, we can move the needle. And so out of that, my relationships was with Black banks and working to promote Black business. His relationship was with the Atlanta Hawks and an owner that had already proven to be very racially conscious and had a bent toward equity. And so I said, look, let's sit down with everything we have and figure out what we can do. And out of that became this idea that he said, you know what? I could finance the entire our sports facility for the Atlanta Hawks. And if Black banks could be a part of that, let's figure out what we can do there. And
okay, wait. Hold that. We're getting to that. That's
okay, well, just to end it there.
Yeah.
To end it there.
Don't end it, but we want to definitely drill down on that. Okay.
So it just begins with, at some point when the march ends, the action has to actually begin. And if you were awoken by, if you had no idea how bad things were before George Floyd, but now, and you're trying to figure out what to do, all of us have something we can do. And the financial decisions that we make have impact. Everyone is going to buy a car. They're going to go to a bank. Everyone is going to go refinance their home or go get a line of credit. It doesn't matter who you are, what color you are, what city you are. you're in, you're going to make that decision. The question is, are you going to make that decision and make it impactful to help us bend this arc towards a little bit more justice in this country?
Brandon, what is the essential role of Black-owned banks?
So Black banks play a critical role, particularly in the Black economy, whether we're talking about providing mortgages so that you can increase home ownership, which is one of the largest assets people will ever own. Whether you're talking about something as simple as basic account services. One thing a lot of people don't realize is so many African Americans are unbanked and underbanked, and as a result, they turn to check cashing services and payday lending companies. And I mean, and the average family could pay upwards of $40,000 in fees, right, to these various institutions over a financial lifetime, which is over double the average Black wealth, right? So Black banks have remained in those communities and provide those essential services. They also provide investment services and small business lending. I mean, you're more apt to receive, if you're an African American, a loan from a Black bank versus a peer majority financial institution. So Black banks have stood in the gap for a very, very long time. They've supported our faith-based institutions, our institutions of higher learning. So they play a very critical role for access to capital. And they now find themselves undercapitalized. And so that's why it was incumbent upon us to ensure that we could shore them up so that they could continue to provide the essential services that we need. Because without capital, no community can grow without capital. I mean, it's like a lawn not receiving water, right? I mean, it's just not feasible.
I remember seeing an interview with a Black-owned bank CEO, particularly when the PPP, when everyone was trying to access those dollars. And he was saying, we're not getting any applications for this. We have money, people. I believe they were based in Indiana. How do Black-owned banks overcome the marketing deficit that, that larger financial institutions can often, insert themselves in Black communities from a branding perspective? But how do Black-owned banks say, hey, we're still here?
Yeah, actually, you want to take it?
Well, I think a part of that is we have to recognize there's a generational gap, right? We have a generation, if you're over the age of 60, you lived in a world where Black banks were far more common. If you're our kids right now in middle school and you're in high school right now, there's only 18 Black banks left, and you may never see a Black bank. You may not even know they exist. They could be relics of your history books, but they may not be a part of your everyday life. This is why we're fighting so hard, because we're on the verge of having the first generation of Americans live in a country without Black banks. And for us, that's not acceptable, because the role that they play, from granting financial literacy and teaching the next generation about financial literacy to being the backbone of access to credit for our businesses and nonprofits. So how do you raise awareness? They have to exist for someone to make sure that you're aware of them. So as we think about a larger strategy, we created the Black Bank Fund. The Black Bank Fund is a private equity fund of $250 million fund that has the sole purpose of investing in Black banks so that they can grow, so that they can increase their market share, so they can increase the amount of credit that they extend to people in these communities. And so that was the reason we created the fund, to put that tier one capital in there. So technically, every dollar of tier one capital can turn into $10 back in the community. For every dollar we invest in a Black bank, they can leverage that 10 times to become student loans, to pay for homes, washers and dryers, cars, start a business, refinance. And so that $250 million can turn into $2.5 billion in economic activity. And when you have that kind of impact, nothing speaks more volume about the credibility of Black banks and the ability to do good than them actually just doing the work. And we want to invest in them doing the work.
Thank you. And Brandon, could you walk us through how the Black Bank Fund finds the Black-owned bank? That's pretty easy. But what's your, your due diligence? What kind of conversations do you initially have? Are all Black-owned banks eligible to receive funding? What is your process?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very holistic process, and I actually want to marry the foundation to the fund in that process, right?
Okay.
Because the fund is really one component of ensuring their sustainability. Capital is one component. So on the foundation side, we'll be working with all of the banks to provide assessments, to help them with strategy development, bringing in really large partners in this space who can provide those strategic planning efforts. That, don't get me wrong, Black banks know that some of the things they need to do, but they sometimes don't have the bandwidth to execute those things. So building that plan, determining whether or not there are opportunities for synergies with other banks, whether or not it's time for them to grow and scale through acquisitions. All of that is the work that the foundation is doing, while also bringing them opportunities like what we'll talk about later with the Hawks transaction, but bringing them deals and things along the way. At that point, after we've assessed them, then the fund will determine the suitable amount, of investment, which right now, there are banks making investments in Black banks. There are a couple of government programs that have been created to help invest in Black banks. And so it's a really exciting time because in addition to our fund, there are other opportunities for the injection of capital into these banks, because even the 250 million that will be plugging into the system isn't enough. I mean, Black banks could certainly take on more, especially over time. So, after we complete that due diligence, then the fund, will be making those investments, and we're making them in a non-voting, non-cumulative preferred way, right? So we're making the capital least intrusive on the banks as possible, so they remain Black, they remain in control, but at the same time, they're working with the foundation and executing on a strategy that'll ensure that they're competitive going forward.
So are these grants, or are they, are they loans that you receive that they have or they're assessed an interest rate? What are these, the funding of Black banks?
Yeah, so it's through our fund, it's a social impact fund. So we'll be buying preferred shares in the banks at a very low interest rate. Through the stimulus plan, there's been some recovery grants that will be made available, to the banks. And then there's also the creation of a couple of other funds that are, I would say, government driven, and they're still determining exactly how those funds would be deployed. So these various mechanisms will take on different faces, and that's another thing. Black banks are so unique as to how they take in capital, that while we're having these conversations, there are also conversations with regulators, to say, hey, look, we have all of these people who want to invest in us. It's time to look at the regulation to ensure that we can take in that capital. And that's a conversation that's not being had broadly enough.
You mentioned that banks, larger banks, financial institutions are looking to or have invested in Black-owned banks. What is that kind of relationship? And I think it was JP Morgan Chase recently invested in a Black-owned bank. What is that relationship? Is it similar to the relationship with the Black Bank Fund?
Well, I think all capital is welcome, right? But all capital is not the same. And so what the Black Bank Fund has strategically focused on is, Brandon alluded to, is that we want to purchase non-voting shares in these banks. And so by purchasing non-voting shares, we don't dilute the Blackness or the ownership of these banks.
Okay.
So if someone comes in and wants to buy equity in a bank, a big bank, many times they want to buy voting shares. And by buying voting shares, they have votes now in these banks. And by having votes, they're taking away votes from other people. So you can dilute the blackness of a bank if you don't buy, the sort of shares that don't trigger that sort of control issue. So, our job is to buy shares in a way that supports the banks and to be supportive of them. So we work very closely with them. Our board of the foundation has on the president of the National Bankers Association, which is a watchdog of minority banks. So that is a big part of our outreach.
And what, besides the financial investment, what other resources do you provide these institutions so that they can thrive, they can flourish?
Yeah, and so that's the exciting part. So through the foundation, we're bringing them loan opportunities. We're thinking through new products and services that they can offer, and really also how to expand beyond just the traditional customer base. One thing, Ashley mentioned earlier, Black banks struggle because Black people struggle, and they have this really high concentration. And we don't want to dilute their mission, right? It's not about injecting capital so that they can simply go and chase customers who could get capital someplace else. But there's value in this diversification because when you have larger companies that are now customers, higher credit quality customers, those generate long-term stable income. They dilute some of the risk that these banks have, and then that allows them to make more investments in the Black community, in low to moderate income communities. So one thing we constantly stress to people is $1 that's lent to a large corporation is not $1 taken away from lending to a Black homeowner or someone like that. We have to think about these banks growing, scaling, and diversifying. That's that recipe to ensure that they're competitive and sustainable going forward. So we've been bringing those opportunities, structuring those opportunities so that it's not also pulling away from the limited bandwidth that the banks have, right? So we're helping them execute on things that would require a larger amount of resources or capital absent us providing those services for them.
You mentioned scaling, both of you did. What does scaling mean to you? Does it mean scaling in the traditional brick and mortar, or leveraging the power of online services so that they can, attract customers globally?
Yeah. The industry is evolving, and Black banks have typically been behind the curve from a technological infrastructure basis. And so we're not even thinking of how we solve for today, right? Because if you solve for today, you're already behind again. But recognizing that as fintech platforms continue to evolve, you have to solve for what banking looks like in the future. So that is a key component: investment in technological infrastructure. One thing Ashley mentions a lot on these talks is, over 60% of Black people say they would bank Black if they could do it, easily and get the same services they get at other banks.
Right.
And so knowing that, it's just solving for that and making those investments in technological infrastructure.
Yeah. And just to add to that, Brandon and I were on a call with Robert Smith, the richest African-American in the country, and he's got it down to a number. He says that if you spend, it's going to take $523 million worth of investments to put Black banks on the same par as their counterparts. And that's a real number. And so the question is, how do we as quickly as possible catch them up, but then also make them sustainable so that they have the resources to keep up? So it's not about just the catch up, it's the keeping up. That's the sustainability part that we have to focus on.
Right. To your point, Ashley, because I was also thinking, is the purpose of your investment so that you have to continue making investments, or that they can just flourish on their own?
No, the goal is that we want to make it viable for first Black people to bank Black and want to bank Black. So that 60% statistic needs to be down into the tens. We need most Black people, if they want to bank Black, to feel they can do it right now
and feel they'll get every service they would get from one of the other, big box banks, and they have access to capital and all the resources. But two, we need every American who wants to bank black to be able to do so and think the exact same way. We want a white person that's got a 790 credit score who wants to refinance $1 million home to be thinking about the Bank of Detroit, to be thinking about Carver Federals. We want them thinking about black banks as well, but maybe not even see them as black banks, see them as banks. And if they see them as banks, then they'll treat them that way. And then you'll finally see the full integration of our economy, because right now our money's not integrated. It's all going one way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I would love for you to share the deal that you have with the Atlanta Hawks, that finance deal. Walk us through that. What's going to be the impact? Share how it happened.
Yeah. So I'll walk through it, and Ashley can talk through, how it came to fruition, and the impact. Okay. But, as we were exploring opportunities, with the Hawks, there was one opportunity, for a line of credit that, would have been helpful, but we determined that they had a practice facility that could be refinanced that would be even more impactful. So a $35 million transaction was put together to refinance this Hawks player development facility that they have in conjunction with Emory. And we saw the opportunity. We came up with a structure and reached out to all of the black banks to form a syndicate, because for a deal that size, no one black bank can take down a $35 million transaction. And that's another thing when we're talking about scale.
Right.
So in order to take down 35 million, 12 banks decided that they wanted to participate. And so we pulled together the syndicate of 12 black banks, being led by Carver State Bank, one of the Georgia banks. And we started working with the Hawks. And it's been a fantastic experience for all the reasons Ashley mentioned. They're a very forward-thinking partner, but we made it seamless for them. So even though 12 banks are involved, it's no different. The way that we're executing this transaction is no different than the way they've executed deals before with their larger banking partners, right? They're dealing, with us in one bank, and then there's a syndicate underneath it. The interest rates that we are able to provide are market rates. Tony Ressler said it in the press conference announcing the deal, that this is just a really good deal with good people at market rates. It just made perfect business sense.
And I think that's what we're solving for, Sabrina. I think that's what this transaction did to change the entire landscape of a possibility in this country, is that for the first time, this deal was historic, because there's never been a sporting franchise or a sporting facility funded by 100% black money, which means black banks led the deal, they executed the deal, they funded the deal. And so now, when you have conversations about supply diversity, we all have to change the scope of that conversation. Mm-hmm. When we talk about supply diversity now, everybody wants to talk about staffing, IT, engineering, marketing. Now it's time to talk about banks. Mm-hmm. When you talk to a corporation now about their supply diversity, they now have to recognize that black people exist, that black banks exist, and there is a possibility, there is a viable alternative for them to bank black if they so choose. It may take us putting all the black banks together in a syndicate, but we can do it. We have done it. So when you're talking to big corporations and they're trying to figure out, how do we really close this racial wealth gap? Right. And they know that they're going to be expanding their manufacturing plant. Are they going to be building a new facility? Are they going to be doing a new line of credit? The question is, are they going to let black people compete for that business? Mm-hmm. Before this transaction, Sabrina, they could easily say, well, we would, but no black bank is big enough to play in these leagues. But now black banks, because of the National Black Bank Foundation, are playing in the major leagues, and they can compete with anybody.
Are there a lot of other entities now at your door to execute on similar deals?
Yeah, I think that we've had a lot of interest, and we've had to the great thing about the Hawks deal is because people call and they'll say, well, we'll let the black banks take some of our loan. We'll let them take, be a part of our participation, our syndicate. We got $80 million. How about we let them take down 5 or 10, which is not bad. We'll take it. But what the Hawks deal did is it showed that black banks can lead a deal, which is different. People are used to letting Citibank and JP Morgan and Bank of America lead a transaction. The Hawks let the black banks lead. So now there's no question that it can happen. So yeah, we have a lot of people with a lot of interest, but the key is we're going to have to keep fighting for people to earn the respect in the banking community that black banks have the sophistication, that we have black experts that may not, like at Denton's and at Comer Capital and KPMG and around the world, that you have black professionals that are coming to the aid of black banks to make sure they have the expertise surrounding them to play in this league. So there's no more excuses for anybody who has a corporation out there. There's not one corporation in this country that does not go to financial markets to exist. The question is, now will they consider true diversity in this space and to consider banking black?
In the final, sorry, please, Brandon.
And the reality is, when they do that, the impact is exponentially greater, right? So the Hawks deal touched 12 banks and over 20 cities that these banks operate in. So when you're talking about receiving the same level of service, the same market rate transaction, but the impact you're having is touching 12 financial institutions and over 20 cities that they represent, and then the revenue they derive being further deployed into those communities, it's a double bottom line transaction that it just makes sense for companies to engage in.
Definitely huge. Would like to also know, as part of that deal, as it relates to construction, hiring, black construction workers to build the facility or companies?
Yeah, so the facility was already built. So this was a refinancing. So, that wasn't, so I'm not certain about what took place during the construction of the facility.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So in the final question, before you share, how anyone can reach you, kind of resources you're interested, the profile of the individuals or entities you're interested in talking with, what message, I think about those who founded the Freedmen's Bureau and those formerly enslaved, Africans who, saved their money in that bank. All these, years later, what would you say to them as relates to your accomplishment, your historic accomplishment with the Black Bank Fund? What would you like to say to them?
Well, I think when we look, if we had to look backwards, and you got to give credit to so many people who come before us, right? And I think the story that sticks out to me is to not be afraid to speak truth to power, even when you're going up against the biggest, industry in our country, which is financial sector. There's a lot of good banks out there that do a lot of good. And there's a lot of banks out there that have been a part of the problem, and so you got to be willing to speak out. And I think the first, the most historical moment was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave. Frederick Douglass that became the first Black president of a bank, and that bank is the bank you mentioned, the Freedmen's Bureau. But it was also Frederick Douglass that shut the Freedmen's Bureau down. It was Frederick Douglass that went to Congress and said that this entity that you have created supposedly for the benefit of freed Africans is actually a sham, actually is investing our money speculatively, and Black people who have very little income, who have saved their money in this bank, are about to lose it all. It took him having that hard conversation with Congress saying, I will go no further, and I will put no more of my money in this bank because it's not benefiting my people, and it's not benefiting the least of these. That same determination, that same statement needs to be considered by every American. Is the bank that I'm putting my money in, whether it's Black or otherwise, does it reflect my values? Does it invest in the things that I hold to be true? Is that we need to give everyone an equal shot to opportunity in this country? If you cannot answer that question, then you may need to have a Frederick Douglass moment and speak out with your pocketbook and with your investments.
Brandon.
How do you go behind the the perfect closing word? So I will just say I share that sentiment, which is why I'm in the trenches with Ashley on this important effort, and I have nothing else to add to that.
How can everyone find the Black Bank Fund?
Yeah, so you can find us online. Our website's blackbankfund.com, Facebook, Instagram, and all the other social media platforms at the same handles. But you can also reach out to Ashley and I. You can email me, blcomer@comercapital.com. We're extremely accessible for anyone who wants to learn more about how they can be involved, be impactful, and get to work in this space.
Everyone, I want to thank the co-founders of the Black Bank Fund, National Black Bank Fund Foundation, Mr. Brandon Comer, who's also, I don't know how they sleep, managing partner of the Comer Capital Group, LLC, and Mr. Ashley D. Bell, a public policy partner at the Denton's law firm. Brandon, Ashley, thank you so much for joining us at the World of Money. Have a great day.
Thank you, Sabrina. Take care.
Bye.